Hello everyone, my name is Fatima Farooq,
And I'm Amna Naqvi.
and we're here to welcome you to the LUMUN training platform in our presentation on the relevance of a small country, how to increase that relevance. So I get that whenever anybody gets a small country for a conference, they end up a little discouraged because the country is not that well known, their stances are not that well known. But it's important to understand there are a lot of pros to these countries as well. The first one being, as we've mentioned, that your stance isn't well known. And what this does is that it gives you a certain sort of flexibility in how you can navigate the committee and shape your own foreign policy. What this leads to is our second point, which is relating to the negotiations and compromises that you can make within the committee. This is important because as a smaller country with a more flexible stance, you're able to make yourself more agreeable and make yourself seem more diplomatic to the dais, which is a quality that the dais members generally look forward to in a good delegate when they're looking at who is able to appease more people and who is able to make the committee more cohesive in terms of the agreements and negotiations that are reached.
So the third pro is just that it's easier for you to shift blame. And what this essentially means is that it's easier for you to criticize other countries because you as a small country are not usually not the sole contributor to a big problem on the world sphere. So you can stand up and you can criticize a country, and rightfully so, for contributing to an issue without worrying about a big backlash or worrying about someone coming and completely criticizing your foreign policy completely. The fourth is strategic researching. So sometimes you may get issues on which you don't have a definitive stance. So what you essentially do is that you start researching on your background, and then you piece together a stance that fits your country's narrative. It shouldn't be outlandish. Don't come up with something that just makes no sense, but you can form your own perspective and your own foreign policy, and in that sense you have more agency in what you're doing. And I guess that's one of the biggest pros of a small country. Right. So in an online scenario, in the near future, we are having online MUNs, and Lumen is also online. So it's important for new delegates and delegates in general to recognize how the importance of mods has generally increased more than it was before. And this essentially means is that as a small country, it becomes even more important for you to give good moderated caucus speeches, which are your formal speeches, for you to speak for a minute or 2 minutes, but speak in a way in which you move people in a structured way, in a way in which your points have both substance and in a way in which you're conveying your points so that other people can really, really listen to them and, kind of want to work with you.
Right, and in relation to what Amna just said about the importance of mods inclusion, what this means is that the amount of importance given to mods by delegates should also increase. So you need to focus more on your speeches, and for that, there are certain public speaking conventions that you need to be very mindful of within an online committee. So, for instance, the 4 points that we're talking about in this presentation are firstly, vocal variation, then voice intonation, then speaking slowly and clearly, and then having good content ready at all times. Briefly put, vocal variation deals with the changes in your voice tone and in the changes of the speed at which you're talking about. So these are the two things that vocal variation and intonation deal with. And it's important to ensure that in your speeches there's a lot of variety in terms of the speed, the tone, the pitch, and even the volume in which you're speaking, because that makes your speeches more impactful and it also makes them more memorable. And also, when you're talking about certain points that you need to stress upon, it becomes easier for other delegates or even the dais members who are listening to you to categorize which points, in your opinion, are more important and more important to stress upon, basically, and which points are just there to substantiate the rest of your speech. Coming up to the speaking slowly and clearly point. This is important, especially in an online scenario, because you need to make sure that the points you're making are widely understood by the delegates and are also remembered. So make sure that when you're speaking or giving speeches, yeah, you properly enunciate your words and you don't rush through your speeches, because that will just result in your content being left as either being misunderstood or having not having been heard in the first place, right? And lastly, is the point relating to content and research, as Anna also talked about. It's important to have good research ready in the back of your mind at all times so that you can always think on your feet in terms of any moderated topics that may be raised or crises that might get thrown at you. But apart from these typical conventions, there are also other videos on our YouTube channel that deal with Model UN speeches and opening speeches. So if anybody wants more information or more guidance on these, please refer to those videos. Moving on to the strategies that you can implement in relation to the pros of your country. So it's not important. It's not important to just know the pro that is related to your country, right? It's also important to know that pro and implement that substantively within committee. So, for instance, we talked about how your stance is flexible. This can be broadly categorized into the first strategy, which is relating to you acting as a mediator between opposing blocs, opposing countries within the committee. There are three things that you need to focus on when you're acting as mediator. Firstly, make sure in your mediation capacity you aren't just taking a back seat by simply mediating who gets to speak at what point, right? You also need to bring your own content and your own points to the table. You need to make sure that the dais knows that you are also contributing in terms of content and are not just there to tell a certain person to stop speaking or to start speaking. Secondly, you can focus on contentions and points of agreements, and this relates to the idea of mergers, right? So, for instance, this is particularly important in unwants. When you are trying to create a merger between two opposing blocks, or when you're trying to prevent the merger between two opposing blocks, by focusing on the existing points of contentions or coming up with new ones that are actually significant and valid, or by focusing on existing points of agreements or vice versa, creating more points of agreement, you can make sure that the mergers that are being made are implemented properly. When you're doing this, also keep in mind that it becomes very apparent in a subtle manner to the dais that you are the pioneer of the merger, right? This is important for a small country to do because if a merger happens and the dais is not aware of why it happened, then regardless of the fact that you conducted it, you will not get much relevance or importance in committee. So make sure that you subtly hint and create the sort of presence in committee that showcases to the dais that you were the major contributor to this merger.
Strategy number two is just marketing your own country specific model for other countries. And what this essentially means is that you find an innovative solution that your country has already come up with in the past, is employing in the present, or will employ in the future. And you identify the fundamental characteristics of that solution. You piece those fundamental characteristics together and you market them on the world sphere in your committee. You can go to your committee and market that solution under a framework. Obviously, this is going to be a little hard to do because this one solution may not apply to all country contexts. Then you can either go to the developed world and you can ask them to employ your solution, to fund your solution, and or to prioritize your solution over others if they are funding solutions in general. And the third thing that you could do, which is the most feasible, is that you could go to the developing world and you could essentially say that, you know what, look, I'm a small country and I'm not that economically strong and I don't have a lot of money, but this is that one solution that worked for me and it was efficient and it was cheap, and maybe you guys should also be employing this solution. And this really does help make you really prominent in committee. Obviously, one drawback can be that in highly competitive committees, other countries may not want a solution that has your name on it and will not, and your solution may not get that much traction. But even so, if you're a little subtle in the way that you market your solution, you can really get that on the resolution.
Moving on to strategy number three is if this is related to bringing your own personal perspective to the committee as a smaller country, right? What this does is that it contextualizes the debate in a way that brings more relevance to your country and to countries like yours. For instance, countries that are your neighbors region wise or who are like you in terms of political circumstances or economic or cultural circumstances. Now, when you're doing this, the most important thing that you need to do is understand that the problems faced by a developing country are much more different than those faced by a developed country. This is the divide between the developed versus the developing world. And this is the divide that you need to capitalize on when you're trying to implement this strategy and committee during your performance at the conference, right? So, for instance, one example would be an economic one, right? So, a lot of developing countries have issues with austerity measures imposed on them by the World Bank and IMF. What you can do is you can raise your voice on this issue and talk about how this particular economic solution is not feasible for your country or for countries like you. Instead, you would much rather prefer to work with a bank such as the Asian Development Bank if you're an Asian country, or you would much rather prefer some other economic solution. For that, you need to market your own solution, which is in conjunction to the strategy number two that Amna talked about. This is also a way in which you can gain traction for your own solutions. And the main substantiating point for such a contention with other solutions would be that you know your country and its politics the best. So you know what is going to work for your country and for countries like yours, and what isn't going to work. So focusing on this will be able to get you a lot of relevance in committee as well.
So strategy number 4 is mostly for unmods, and we have more detailed videos on this on our channel. What and I personally think this is the best strategy that you could use if you're not able to orchestrate a merger. So if the contention is too big and among the two or the three bigger blocks you're not able to orchestrate a merger, what you can essentially do is start forming your own block. So the first type of block that you could make is a neutral block, which is a block that doesn't agree with either side of the radical solutions that are being proposed. And in this neutral block you can clump together all of the countries that really want a solution that works for everyone and not just for a certain part of the committee. Obviously, this looks amazing in front of the dais because you look like that one delegate who is being diplomatic and who is moving towards consensus, who is moving the committee forward instead of just rigidly staying inside their own foreign policy blocks. The second type of bloc that you could make is a region based bloc that could be between Asian countries, African countries, or European countries. And what you can essentially do in this bloc is that you could bring your own regional perspective in. This is something that Fatma also talked about. In this sense, for example, you take the smaller developing countries of Asia or the smaller developing countries of Africa. And what you essentially do is that you bring your own perspective to the committee floor. And in terms of your region, you say that whatever solution is being proposed or whatever issue is being discussed, it really, really hurts your region. It hurts your neighbors, and by extension, it hurts you. And in that way, you're being more empathetic in the solution that you're bringing forward to this committee. And obviously, a drawback of forming a separate bloc can be that if you have a really big ally and your foreign policy is kind of contingent on that ally, if you form a separate bloc, the dais may feel like that's a really peculiar thing that the smaller country is doing. So, for example, if Mexico is forming a separate bloc from the United States of America, that may look a little peculiar. So, what you should do then is that if you don't have a contention, what you do is you form a bloc with your bigger ally. But in those instances, as a smaller country, you do need to cement yourself as the co-leader of the bloc and not just as a right-hand man. So, as a co leader of the bloc, you could either be the voice of the smaller countries that are in the bloc, you could then again be the voice of the developing countries in the bloc, and then you can really move the debate forward. Obviously, then again, your moderated caucuses, they play an instrumental role in you showcasing that you are definitely the co leader, that you are calling the shots, and you are making big and important decisions. And just one last tip, please don't form a bloc just for the sake of forming a block. Always form a block if you have a contention. If you just form a block because you think it's going to make you win a big award, you're wrong. And DIAS members really, really don't look at that appreciatively.
Right.
Next slide.
One last point to add in forming blocks. One issue that most small countries or delegates representing small countries have is that they don't even know how to form a block with a country that's not really prominent. For this, it becomes important to really have a good grasp over your unwards. If you have good support in committee, right, then it becomes much more easier for you to create a block in the first unmoderated caucus that you have. The support that you get from the committee is also inevitably tied with the speeches that you give. So, as you mentioned previously, especially in online sphere, focus a lot on the speeches that you give. Make sure that they're impactful, that they're memorable, and then delegates, especially delegates who may not have too much experience, will reach out to you. And do make sure that you also reach out to such delegates yourself as well, not in a fake manner, but in an actually genuine manner that makes them feel as if they are being heard, as if their concerns are being catered to. And in that sense, you will be able to create the support that you need in order to form a block for yourself.
So now we're just going to be moving on to some examples, some hypotheticals, and we're going to tell you how you can go about them. This is an example from SOCHUM. Obviously, the topic is combating racism, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and your country is Afghanistan. Now, obviously, when you're going to do preliminary research on Afghanistan, you're going to realize that this country has bigger problems to deal with right now. They have to worry about the possibility of a civil war, a possibility of, I don't know, maybe another proxy war erupting. And in that sense, the country does the major kind of problem that the country is facing right now is not institutional, for example, institutional racism. But obviously you're going to be wrong, and that's why it's important for you to research about your country's place in the issue. So whether your country has contributed to the issue, how the issue is affecting your country specifically, and then from then on you can go on to see the strategies that we've already outlined and see the one that fits perfectly for you. So in this sense, I think strategy number 2 and 3 would fit in. In strategy number 2, you could, for example, as a solution or as a model, you could talk about the Loya Jirga that the Afghanistan has used throughout their history to come up with consensus. And the Loya Jirga is just like a consolidation of different tribal leaders. So because Afghanistan is so diverse, they sometimes call the Loya Jirga to come and form consensus on big issues. And you could come up in your committee and talk about the Loya Jirga and how instrumental it's been, how it's a traditional tool that has been used to make a wholesome consensus come for your country. And then when you're talking about that, obviously you're going to attract a lot of other countries that also have these traditional tools, and you could talk about empowering those traditional tools as a form, as a diverse solution. In strategy number 3, in which you're contextualizing the debate, then again you could talk about just how the problem has affected you throughout your history. You could talk about like any persecution taken by the Hazaras. You could talk about how the Afghani government in the negotiations with the Taliban really does want to bring a minority perspective in that negotiation table as well. And from then on, you could show a developing country or a small conflict ridden country's perspective on racism and intolerance and xenophobia as well. And you could then again, as in strategy 3, bring your own relevance and make yourself more relevant. Over to you.
Yeah, moving on to the second example where we have political committee. This is a DISEC, and in this example, the topic is the Vietnamese crisis, and your country is Peru, right? So for this particular topic, I feel as if strategies 1, 3, and 4 hold the most weight, right? The reason for this is that, firstly, in strategy number 1, it talks about how you have mediation power, your stance is flexible, and your foreign policy is thus also flexible. Make use of this fact to make yourself seen as a sort of country that is a pioneer in the mediation process. Reach out and extend a helping hand to the country in crisis in order to make your bloc or your country seem like a sort of safe haven that that particular country can go to, as opposed to other blocs, such as a bloc led by the United States for this particular topic, which might seem very antagonizing for the country in crisis, right? Then again, when you look at the block formation strategy for this particular topic, what you need to focus on is that you create a region based block for Latin American countries in order to aid Vietnam, in order to make sure that you lift it out of the crisis that it's found itself in, right? Now, with such a region based block, you will be able to exert control and dominance over the block as well in a very subtle manner, because Peru is also a Latin American country. And B, you will be able to make sure that you exclude countries that are threatening or controversial in relation to the topic and in relation to the country that you are trying to aid. For instance, you have a very good contention against the US. What this does is you can make sure that the bloc doesn't have other delegates who may be dominant within committee, and who can also take over your bloc as well. So that makes sure that you get to assert control and retain it in your own bloc, and then thus also retain the relevance or significance of your country with this topic, right? And thirdly, in terms of contextualizing the debate, which is another one of the strategies that we've already talked about, you need to make sure that you focus on the smaller details. You need to make sure that your research focuses on region specific details or topic specific details that you can use either to create contentions or solutions that you can implement in terms of your performance within committee. And lastly, as Amna also mentioned, You need to make sure that you're empathetic to the rest of the committees, that the rest of the countries within the committee. You need to make sure that you always listen to them, you listen to their concerns and cater to them, and you always make use of their solutions as well, and try to make sure that you inculcate them within your draft resolutions as well. So, taking all of this together, it makes sure that you are able to think on your feet, be fast in terms of a crisis situation. You are agreeable to other countries within the committee as well, and you create a sort of diplomatic persona for yourself in front of the DISE members, which will inevitably help you in terms of winning an award.
So, yeah, just I think the key takeaways from this video are just that you're very relevant as a small country, you have more agency, and you have more of an onus on being diplomatic and kind of being empathetic towards other countries than a bigger country would. And I guess that's it. If you have any questions, please do post in the comment section. Please like and share this video with any other new debaters or with your friends. And please subscribe to our channel. We come up with new videos, and we really do help, I think, newcomers with their Model UN journey. Thank you. Bye.